Two friends meet up to drink some beers and talk about past times. Not yesterday, but long ago, it's scandals, wars and crimes. From Stalin's reign to Prohibition, Tudors, Pompey, Bush and NASA's mission, Edison's Vogue, Genghis Khan's rise to victory. Forget your old teacher, it's time for Pint-Sized History.
Hi there, I'm Joe.
I'm Zack.
And welcome to Pint-Sized History, where we look at the landmark events that shape the modern world we live in and talk about them thoroughly and with a lot of fun and also a few drinks. Speaking of drinks, Zack, what are we drinking today?
Well, Joe, I came prepared, unlike some people. Ooh. So I've got myself a Scandinavian beer because the episode today is about the Vikings. Skål! I've got a horn. If you can't see, if you're not watching it,
you've got a horn. That's ridiculous. Horn. Why we got these little props as if we're something that would be so stupid to just have a. Oh, what's this? Oh,
those of you who aren't watching the live broadcast, Joe has also got a horn. You like?
I'm just showing to the camera. I'm just showing them.
So we're talking about the Vikings today, and this is a topic I've always adored. When I was a kid, I used to be just Viking mad. And it all stems from when, my dad bought me a version of Age of Mythology, which is a computer game. It's like a real-time strategy game, like Age of Empires. But you could basically be like Egyptians or Greeks or Vikings, and you learn all about the gods. And I was so into it. I loved it. I loved being a bit Loki and going around and causing trouble. And we'll get onto that later. But that's kind of where this whole love for it came from. And my dad and I also watched the Vikings TV show. So I've been into this for years. I really like it. I love it.
Well, I'm happy to hear it. Also, I'm glad we're just doing something that's completely different because like every episode we've done so far has been like 20th century or 10 years ago, but modern wars or modern history to a certain extent. And now we're just doing something completely different. So I'm looking forward to it purely for that sense.
Vikings, as we know them today, were a seafaring people from Scandinavia, from Nordic countries, which includes Sweden, Norway, Denmark and Finland, but the ones we kind of focus on in our history, English histories particularly, are Danes and Norwegians. Swedish went east, and the Danes and Norwegians went west. So throughout this episode, I'm going to, like I always do, conflate two things to one another. I'm going to say that the Vikings were the Norsemen, and the Vikings did this when actually it's Norsemen, but what I really mean, I might get it wrong, but just bear with me.
Yeah, don't worry. I'm sure everyone will bear with you very nicely.
Thank you.
Don't worry. I'm bearing with you right now.
What we know of them is essentially them being these great warriors, these conquerors who got on their long ships, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, sailed across the North Sea and got to English cities and English towns and pillaged them and killed people. And that is what they did. But there's so much more to them than just raiders and conquerors. They had an incredibly deep culture, traditions, society, which they eventually brought to England and France and other areas they visited. The Vikings, they went as far east as Baghdad. They got all the way from Norway, wherever they were in Oslo or Copenhagen, which weren't the towns they were today. And they sailed all the way down through Russia, down the Volga River to Baghdad and North Africa at the same time.
You can't escape talking about the effing Volga River. You can't. You just have to throw in just one little Volga River. If it's Afghanistan, if it's Stalingrad, if it's here, you just got to make sure everyone knows this random river in the heart of Russia.
Great river. Anyway, nowadays the Vikings are ridiculously famous. Like, there's TV shows about them, like the Vikings, like I mentioned before, about Ragnar Lothbrok or Lothbrok, depending on the pronunciation of it, Rollo and Bjorn Ironside. And then you've also got the films about them, like The Northman.
Yeah, also one thing about the Vikings and their cultural significance, you go to any fancy dress shop, there's Viking outfits. Everyone loves to dress up with the outfits, which I'm sure you're about to tell me.
Oh, yeah.
It's
an insult to Vikingdom everywhere.
Vikingdom.
That's not a word. But
it is now.
That's the way people envisage them, right? These massive, hulking men, 6 foot tall, really long hair, attractive. And they were attractive with the horned helmets. The problem is with the Vikings is that there's no real recorded texts about them.
Yeah,
there's no accounts of the Vikings themselves besides like a 13th century Icelandic poet called Snorri, who wrote a really famous thing called Snorri's Edda, which basically talks about them in like mythology and poetry. And besides that, the only thing you can really like focus on is the Frankish and English accounts of like monks and stuff in monasteries who got pillaged by them. It's talking about how they're like horrible heathens and stuff.
Yeah, that's one of the things I do know about the Vikings, is that despite all the things we know that they enjoyed to do, like sailing and pillaging and adventuring, they were not writers. They basically kept no documented record of their society. So a lot of it is not necessarily guesswork, but, you know, estimating what they might have been like. So I feel like I'm going to assume that a lot of the stuff we're going to talk about today, you've got to take with a pinch of salt, maybe.
Yeah. So that's kind of the difficulty I had in planning this episode is where do I take the Vikings? So I'm going to briefly set out a bit of background about them, what they were like, what they believed in, where they came from, when the Viking Age started, and then we'll go from that because there's really not much historical information to go on, to talking about a number of Viking legends.
Skål.
So heroes that, you know, classic ones being Ragnar Lothbrok, like I said, Ivar the Boneless, King Cnut the Great.
Oh.
So the Viking Age lasts from around 793 AD at the sacking of a monastery called Lindisfarne, to around 1066 AD, which is the Battle of
Stamford Bridge.
Very nice, yes.
Which is the same year as the Battle of Hastings, but we'll get to that in a moment.
Yeah.
If you know that year for the
maybe.
Battle of Hastings.
Over these 200 years, the Vikings have pretty much dominance over the sea. They conquer England and France, and they go ranging from places like North Africa to Baghdad, Jerusalem, Turkey. They're going all over the world, spreading their ideas, settling in Greenland, Iceland, and Canada and North America. The best place to start probably is separating Vikings from Norsemen. Do you know the difference between Vikings and Norsemen, Joe?
I'm going to have a guess.
Go on.
So Norsemen are people from the north. That's the word Norse, it means that, right?
Yeah.
Northmen, essentially. Vikings were the adventurers of those people, the people that went out to discover new lands and either migrate to them or, you know, take from them.
Well, yeah, you're pretty close. So Vikings and Norsemen, they're all Scandinavians. They're all from either Denmark, Sweden, Norway, or Finland. They're from Scandinavia. They're Norse, which is where this Norse culture grew. They all speak Old Norse, which is a language. It's an old Germanic language. This was the case to about the 14th century. They all spoke that until then. Fun fact, Old Norse was once the most widely spoken language in Europe. They spoke it all the way from Newfoundland all the way to the Volga River in Kiev. And I love the Volga River.
I didn't even need to say anything.
You should know all about the Volga River if you watched episode 2 on Stalingrad. If you haven't, go back. Great episode.
no one's pausing this to go watch.
God, I gotta go back.
57 minutes of Stalingrad before coming back. Okay, now I'm caught up. I know what the Volga River is. Continue.
So Norsemen and Vikings, they were primarily farmers, craftsmen, traders, all walks of life you get in like the early medieval age. And what separates them is that Vikings went pillaging, raiding, conquering. There's the word for it is literally going Viking. It's Vikingar. Do you like the pronunciation?
So it's a verb.
Yeah.
It's literally a verb to Viking, which means to do those things.
So Viking is our interpretation of the Norse word Vikingar, which is a pirate or someone that goes raiding.
Interesting.
The reason why they were able to do that, because they were able to travel to these faraway places like England and France, well, not too far away today, but a very long distance at the time, was because they developed something called a longboat, which is essentially a technological marvel at the time. I don't know if you can see the pictures behind me very well, but essentially it's this ship, this wooden ship, fairly narrow, stereotypically got the dragon's head, but didn't always have that. The way the ship is built basically allowed them to range over vast ocean expanses. They're just basically, the Vikings are Norsemen who've got a bit tired of the farming and the dull lifestyle.
As you would.
Yeah.
As you would. I would guess that part of the reason that Vikings felt so, you know, that they should go and raid and pillage is that there just wasn't that much at home. It was cold.
Nothing to do.
No,
not the 30 on
I'm not mugging off their life style. I'm just saying that it's obviously a lot colder up north, the further north you go especially. I imagine that some of the area in Norway is not particularly great farmland. I mean, it's so fjordy and mountainous. So I imagine that for them, a lot of the opportunity to, you know, not only gain wealth, but also to just gain status for your family and all that, you know, experience and all this is to adventure. And I'm sure there was a lot of like gravitas to those that went out.
You're absolutely right. That is like the hook of what Vikings did. It's all about legacy. It's all about like being this hero. So Snorri, this Icelandic poet who's written this Edda, he gives the accounts of gods and what they might say, and he says, cattle die, kinsmen die, you yourself will also die, but the fame of a dead man's deeds, which I imagine that last line. You might die, you might leave the mortal plane, but your words and the actions and what you've done, they'll stay here forever.
Yeah, and I think that was probably more of a thing for their culture, their specific, and also their religions as well. That legacy, and especially fighting legacy, was very, very important. That's definitely one of the things that maybe is a stereotype of the Vikings that surely must have some merit, is that they cared a lot for their status as a fighter, as their status as an adventurer, and to be able to do these things. It showed a lot of grit and determination and strength. And I imagine that was a huge part of what made the great Vikings, is this sense of, chest out, what can I accomplish, how far can I travel, what can I do, what are the deeds, is a huge part of the legacy that they want.
Have you read these notes?
I haven't, no.
Because that's the next thing I'm going to talk about.
No.
You're right. No, it's because of their religion. Like they literally pray to gods, and these gods are like martial gods. They're all about like war and fighting and like justice and adventure and Odin himself. The idea is that any Viking worth their salt will get killed in battle, holding their axe, and they'll get taken to Valhalla. And do you know what the name was for the Vikings that was so feared in battle? Like the ultimate warrior Vikings. You know the name?
Of course.
Go on.
Well, actually, I say that. I might know the English name. I don't know if I know the...
It's probably very close. It's like an I before the last letter or something.
Berserker.
Berserker, yeah.
Oh, is that word from Norse? Berserker?
Yeah, to go berserk.
Ah,
So like
that makes a lot of sense.
The craziest, fiercest warriors would be called berserkers, and it's like stereotypical that what they do is get high on mushrooms or something, and they go into the war or go into the battle and just fucking kill everyone.
So is that true?
They didn't get mushrooms. I think they got high a little bit, but typically they just get drunk as fuck. And then just just go out of there and be like, whoa, and they just like end up killing their mates and stuff like that.
That was the thing about Berserker, was that they basically were the most feared because they would just go out and go so crazy that they would essentially just attack anything in front of them, and you just wanted to get out of their way and let them do their thing if you were on their side. And if they weren't on your side, then you would have so much fear because you're seeing this machine just barreling towards you.
So here's what happens when the Viking dies. This is what they believe in. So they believe that when they get killed in glorious battle, as they want to do, they are taken to Asgard, which is the realm of the gods. They're then taken to this grand, sprawling, majestic hall with the greatest legends that have gone before them. If you're killed in 900 or 1000 AD, you might see Ragnar there chilling. You might catch a little glimpse of Odin, have a little how's your father with him. They'll be escorted by the Valkyries, and every day they just fight. They just go at each other, and then after the fighting, every day they get magically healed by the Valkyries, they drink and feast, and the next day they fight all over again, and they just fight and drink and eat and die and fight and drink and eat and die. And that's like the pinnacle of what they're aspiring for.
That's Valhalla, is this concept of literally just when you die, you get transported to this
Viking heaven.
Other place that you can just fight and then drink and then do it again the next day, every day, because that is their version of heaven.
Yeah. So importantly here, though, Valhalla is not the end for Vikings. Valhalla is... they go to Valhalla because they're training for Ragnarok, which is when the forces of chaos fight against the gods, and they come down from Asgard, and they basically do battle until eventually the forces of chaos win, and the world is born anew again. It's kind of like similar to like all religions. We have this idea of the end or rebirth, or like the cyclical nature of life, where a prophet will come, the Messiah, everyone be reborn again, sins be washed away. And it's kind of mental that this has been going on for hundreds and thousands of years. I guess because death is so ever apparent in everyday life, you must think like everything's got to be based on that. The tenets of everything you do have to be based on the fact that you're going to die one day and what that means.
Yeah.
Do you think it's comfort, like making yourself believe?
Yeah. What would make sense is that for a lot of religions, and these can be extinct religions or religions that have survived for thousands of years, there are certain things that every person on this earth kind of has in common, and that is a fear of death, or rather the knowledge that death will come, and the hope or praying that there is something afterwards that means you're not just done forever. And that's where some cultures love legacy, because they think if there isn't an after, or you want your legacy to be on this earth or whatever. So there's all these different facets. This is the trend of religion, that everyone is just trying to find their root, and if they find any religion that can kind of work for them and put them on the way that they feel a little bit better, then that's the way. And I think you can see that because Viking religions, Norse religions. What is the Norse religion called?
Astaru, I think.
Yeah, this concept of Astaru is pretty much the same as lots of different concepts for lots of different religions worldwide. The difference is it's framed in this kind of tough, northern, battle-hardened, cold, drinking a lot mentality of, when we die, we go somewhere and we get fucked up. In Christianity, it's the same. When we die, we go somewhere and it's bliss. But their version of bliss isn't getting drunk and, it's being up in the clouds.
It's fighting and drinking and killing.
It's different for all of them. But I think the main, I don't know, the strings are often the same or very similar.
Do you reckon, the reason why religions were so, fervently adhered to and, worship was because death was, all around them in those days? People died young. People died, 40 years old, and that was a long life.
Yeah, I do think that's partly the case, but I also think it's much more just the fact that there was an education and the concept of science was barely a thing.
Of course.
So why would you trust if you don't know much, if there's not much to explain everything happening around you because there's no scientific fact anyway, no one's got these scientific answers for you, then you are going to want to cling on to something, and religion was just the obvious one. If you have no clue at any stage of your life, in any era until quite recently when science has become more of a thing, why you're here, what you're doing, or what the whole purpose of life is. And of course you're going to trust some random priest or some random, bishop or whatever that says the reason is because of this, and this is why you should follow these religions because that's why everyone kind of, jumped into them. And that's why culture and religion are so heavily entwined, because the cultures you were part of were the religions that you went after. Another thing that I do know about the Vikings is that when they would come and raid cultures that weren't Norse, weren't Astaru, they freaked the fuck out, because not only are these random people they've never seen before in their life, but they're people that don't adhere to the same religious values and beliefs, because they're like, whoa, we wouldn't kill in a church. You can't kill in a church. It's a sacred place. You can't spill blood in a church. Why would they care? They're Vikings. They don't give a fuck.
It's funny you said it, because there's a famous account of of monks at the time when, and we're literally about to get to this, but when the Vikings first invaded the monastery, it was the first raid in England, and the monks at the time said, the heathens poured out the blood of saints around the altar and trampled on the bodies of saints in the temple of God like dung in the streets. They're like, what the fuck?
Yeah, they can't believe it.
They're our God, they're our saints, they're our heroes.
Yeah.
Stop it.
And part of the reason why they're saying that and thinking it is because they're so close-minded, because all they've ever known is England and Catholicism. Yeah. They've never met anyone from another religion. So in their mind, everyone worldwide should also be by the same principle. They won't have any idea that there's people that follow a different religion elsewhere. I mean, they might have some concept that there might be that elsewhere, but they're not going to know who these people are. So suddenly they come in and go, oh, well, fuck, they're going to go kill all of us and pillage everything, but at least they'll leave the church alone like good Christians do. And then they're like, what the fuck, the church as well? Guys! They would have no idea that this would be the case.
Let's get to talking about the Viking gods. Okay. We've just talked about religion extensively. So I guess it's fair to talk about their gods. So they worshipped a number of gods, not just one, like modern day religions. Odin is basically the Norse Zeus. Yeah. He's like the chief of all gods. His home was Asgard, where Valhalla was. He's called the All-Father. He's commonly depicted with one eye, and he has two crows on either side of him called Hugin and Munin. And he's like a cloaked guy that travels around and sometimes takes human forms and fucks your wife. And that sort of shit.
Oh, really?
Yeah. There's stories about him just going around and having his way.
Oh, wow.
Classic Odin. What a guy.
Odin the fuckboy.
You got Thor, who's the god of thunder and storms. He's typically depicted as lightning during long sea voyages. You basically have to appease him before you go on these voyages. And he had a hammer called Mjolnir. You know about that?
Yeah, this is the... Yep.
It's the one that only people who are worthy can pick up. There's always, in history, always stories about, swords that will only bequeath themselves to those that are right for, Excalibur, which is not real. You got Freya, the goddess of love, fertility, and battle. She's basically like a boss. She received half of the slain warriors in her hall. And the other half went to Valhalla, so... She loves a bit of fighting as well. Even in Norse society, this was not the case at all anywhere else in Europe at the time. But there was a strong egalitarian culture where
I find that so interesting.
It's cool, isn't it? Women had basically not the same rights as men, because at that time, women did not have any rights at all, basically. But as far as most cultures go, they had far more than any other. They were allowed to fight. I think they were allowed to own property, had a more revered status in Viking society. I spoke to a Norwegian last night at the pub that I went to, and she said that that's actually a bit of a misnomer. Apparently, it's not actually fact that they did have as much legal rights as they did in other cultures, because they said they examined the DNA of like burial sites and places of like mass killing and murder, and apparently the majority of people that were killed had chromosomes of women. So, whilst they were equal, they were also just like, she's a witch, let's kill her.
It's still the Middle Ages, so I'm not surprised at all that for most of these, women, they were still treated far worse than the majority of men were, especially in a culture that is so tough and so brutal.
Yeah.
I'm not surprised at all that's the case. But it is still fascinating that when so many other religions and cultures put this patriarchal twist on the world so heavily, especially the main religions that we know that have kept to this day,
and yet like today,
well, of course they are still going to this day. But it's just so interesting that Vikings and the Norse culture just decided to, I don't know, I wonder why that is. I wonder why that is such a even if it's not as pronounced as we wish it were, or we hoped that it would be when we look back on history. It's still just so interesting that the concept of a shield maiden, as they were called, right, for this Viking woman that would fight in battle. I mean, that's just not a thing. That's just not a thing in the concept of a woman battling in a English Catholic army is just not a thing. And there might, there's the small example here or there of
even like modern times,
of course,
having snipers in the Soviet army was like whoa, what the hell?
Yeah.
So we said Freya.
Yes.
As the goddess of love, fertility, and battle. But also Loki, who's my favourite god, who's the trickster god. There are so many just completely abhorrent and morally strange stories involving Loki. A classic one is where he turned himself into a horse, seduced another horse, and he gave birth to an 8-legged horse named Sleipnir, who became Odin's steed. But he does this all the time. He just goes around and shapeshift into horses and wolves and has sex with other horses and wolves, and then basically births an enormous monster.
Fair play.
So it's predicted that one day the gods would battle their enemies and that would just destroy the world, leading to a rebirth of the world. This is called Ragnarok, and this is what they're training for in Valhalla. So we're coming on to less about the celestial and more of the human element of it. But do you know what these Vikings wanted, Joe? You touched on it before with
I would guess 2 or 3 main things, and those things would be that the legacy, which you'd already mentioned, of wanting to be able to create a name for yourself and a renown that would carry on past your death and carry on to your children and all that. But also just the chance for opportunity, right? Because there's so much wealth and stuff out there that you can't necessarily get in this small little village in northern Norway. So for you, your best chance is to go out there somewhere and try and find something, pillage, raid, make a name for yourself, but in the process, find opportunity and see what you can do. And a lot of Viking adventurers didn't just go out and pillage and raid. They would settle and they would live in those lands that they've just conquered, because they wanted to live in a more fertile, they wanted more opportunity for themselves and their family. And again, it's all about legacy. It's about what you can bring.
So yeah, that's a big thing you touched on. You said earlier that land in Scandinavia is incredibly hard to farm on. It's really rugged and horrible terrain. So it's not arable land, which is what it's called. I think that's the word for arable land. Yeah. So there's a very limited amount of it. But in England and France and Iceland, where they eventually settle one day, there's really nice land. Yeah. Great soil. So before I start getting into the chronology of the Viking Age and when it started and when it ended and the heroes along the way, I just want to touch on some common misinterpretations about the Vikings.
The horn helmets.
Horn helmet.
Come on, that's the famous one.
They didn't wear them.
We should really start a petition to get rid of this horned helmet facade that's ruined this mythology of the Vikings.
Yeah, so you're right. First of all, horn helmets, they didn't wear them, and classic thing also is that they drink out the skulls of their enemies. They did not do that. So it's commonly thought that they were lawless and wild. But the legal systems of the Nordic worlds were actually very sophisticated.
Okay.
The Alþingi, which is Iceland's national parliament, is one of the world's oldest parliaments.
Dates back to Viking times.
Yeah, 930 AD. And they had like a common thing where they would call local assemblies and like political bodies thingies. The thingy, the old thingy. They called local assemblies in the UK during King Cnut's reign thingies.
It's the same for me. When I forget a word, I just go the thingy. It's true. Like, oh, Zach, can you give me the thingy over there?
I think that's exactly the same.
It is, right?
I'm now going to walk you through Lindisfarne. Do you know what Lindisfarne is, Joe?
Is it a agricultural age?
No, you're completely wrong. It is a monastery in Northumbria.
Oh, this is the one.
Yes.
This is how it all began.
I think it's Northumberland right now. But back then it was part of an English kingdom called Northumbria.
Yeah, it wouldn't be for long.
And it was...
Got him!
So at the time it was home to a monastery and apparently an incredibly important centre of Christianity in England. They sacked it terribly. They killed the monks. They took children as prisoners, looted it. And that's kind of... now set the scene for the next 250 years.
They took the children prisoners?
Yeah, they took so many prisoners. They loved a slave. Oh, they loved him.
Ooh.
Oh, couldn't get enough.
Oh, Jesus, I've just been bigging them up for the last however long, and now you've told me that they're into slavery.
This sort of symbolises the start of the Viking Age, because England, at the time, have loads of monasteries.
Yes.
On islands, in river mouths, on cliffs, in secluded communities, because they wanted to take them away from towns to stop spiritual and religious interference, and they were just ripe for the picking.
Yeah. Well, and that's the other thing about them, though, is that we were such idiots that we were like, and Christians in general, because we didn't even comprehend the fact that anyone could come over here and take our nice shiny gold. We were like, no way, everyone's a Christian, everyone's a respectable person, we all love and respect our monasteries, no one's going to touch anything. So
You ain't kill me.
You ain't gonna kill me.
Kill me.
I'm a priest. You're not gonna kill me. Nobody's killing me. So
Big up Ross Kemp.
So we would leave. The church would essentially garner all this wealth, all these jewels and everything, and just keep in monasteries without any guards. Because it was just so respected, that it was so brainwashed that everyone was, all these peasants that had absolutely nothing were like, oh, look, that church over there has got all that nice shiny gold. They're like, can't do anything about it. Oh, no, but we love them so much. They pay for our bills. And in actuality, they're just literally feeding off these poor peasants.
We ain't got no shirt on our back, but we sure will give our next 2 pennies to the church.
Yeah, the church's like, oh, that's a nice brooch you've got. That's been in my family for 3 generations.
We'll have it now.
Well, I think we'll take that for the in the name of Christ. All right, you twisted my arm as far as it will go.
This event is not only significant as the first riot, or first raid, but it's also significant as it symbolises their disdain for God. Because, like you said, they don't give a flying fudge about Christianity or their idols. For them, they're false gods.
I mean, to be fair, why would you? Like, if you're in a culture that's so about the warrior spirit, about these Norse gods fighting tooth and nail, and then you kind of just find this little monastery with it, and you're like, there's no gods.
They got bald hairs.
Yeah, they've all got bald hair. As Vikings, you just go, oh, F off, mate. I don't care 1 iota about your bloody thingy, about your whatever. What's his name? God.
Also, at this time, they sort of become a bit of a military power because they're not an organised army. They're a bunch of different villages from different tribes and villages in Nordic countries, but they have this very famous thing that they all do in Scandinavia called a shield wall, which is essentially when they all band together, they all lock their shields together, and they form this like impenetrable wall.
That wasn't the first time that happened in history, right? Like they weren't the inventors of putting shields together to protect themselves. But in terms of medieval history, it was not a tactic that was very regularly seen.
History is like defined by these sudden power shifts where this like random nation or like power will develop the style of fighting which is just really, really good. And they'll have really strong military leaders who can like adapt it really well. They fight a lot. So they're experienced and they build up this like sort of wealth of knowledge. A classic one springs to mind is like the Alexander the Great with the Macedonians who had these they had what they called phalanxes.
That is a podcast episode.
Oh yeah, for sure.
I'd love to do Alexander the Great.
So they have phalanxes where they just similar to a shield wall, they form like turtle formations and they band together and they have these massive long spears. And the armies at the time just didn't know how to deal with it. They come up against like elephants and just stab them from far range.
Yeah.
And that is like a common occurrence, like the English with the longbowmen.
Yeah. Any way you can get your leg up in history, if you can have any sort of advantage, that's why technology in general is just so important, and why technology is so focused on in militaries to this very day and all the way throughout history, is making sure that you have the newest thing that can give you that edge in battle. And, you know, most cultures have their own version of it.
The atom bomb.
Yeah,
like well, last episode.
Probably, yeah. I mean, nuclear warfare is probably the most iconic of all of those, because it is literally this fight between a certain few nations that hate each other
technology
to find a technology that will completely annihilate the other. And yeah, I guess we're at the end stage of that in that sense. But that is exactly it, is this kind of constant band of figuring out what's the next thing that will beat everyone else. And back in the day, it would have been elephants or really long spears called phalanx, or camels,
legions,
and
legions.
All these different things. Cavalry was a great example. Before, you know, cavalry was huge when it first became a thing.
And then armor, plate, mail, chain mails, just being able to fashion and produce different items. And the machine gun.
Yeah, of course, yeah. With the gun.
All these like crazy things have just completely changed the world we live in today. And it was the same back then. If it wasn't just like the actual thing itself, like it wasn't a musket or like the idea of gunpowder or catapults, it would have been the way that people fought together. And this shield wall was particularly effective because it completely stumped the British. They didn't know how to do it. They couldn't fight against it. The Vikings were so good in the sea. They had complete dominance of the sea, which is really important for trade routes and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So they were just basically at the mercy of these really, really epic fighters. So let's get into the heroes of the story. The heroes are the legends. And the first one, do you want to hazard a guess? Probably the most famous of all the Vikings.
What, the one that's on the TV show? Mm-hmm. Ragnar Lothbrok.
Yeah, Ragnar Lothbrok. Ragnar, according to historians, was a Danish and Swedish king. He led several Viking invasions to kingdoms in England and Paris, and he is like the eponymous Viking hero. When you think about him, you think about the way that the TV shows depicted him as like this long flowing hair and like good-looking blue eyes, very tall and muscly,
very aloof, very inspiring, I guess, because he's very like he's kind of the definition of the kind of person that if you were a Viking, you would just follow straight into battle.
Absolutely, yeah. And this is kind of what gives him his notoriety and his fame, at least him having kingdoms and successful invasions. But there's very, very little known about him. We don't know if he existed, like I said before. We got some evidence of others existing. Ragnar is like a bit of he's a grey area. We just generally don't know. By Frankish accounts, because this is where it gets important, he was known famously as a leader of the Viking army that sacked and besieged Paris in 845 AD. So after sacking the city, and this is a classic thing in Viking Age history. So what they would do is they would sack the city, they would completely destroy it, and then they would get paid off by the kings. They would get paid, in this case, in the siege of Paris, they got paid 2,570 kilos of silver and gold by Charles the Bald, who was then the West Frankish king. This marked what was called the system of Danegeld, which is where they would go around, they would find a random town, they would lightly pillage it, lightly sack it, steal a few people, kill a few people, and then they basically go afterwards, we've got your people, you want them back, start paying, moolah moolah.
It's quite clever, really, isn't it?
Yeah. They're basically fucking criminals.
They're gangsters of the medieval age.
Ragnar is legendarily known for fathering a number of sons. Do you know any of them?
Yeah. Because, I feel like I should say, the reason that I know some of this information is because, like Zach, I have watched some of the TV show The Vikings. I'm not, it's just Vikings actually, not The Vikings. I'm not a huge fan, I gotta say.
Joe hated the show, and I knew he hated it, and he hated particularly this one character called Floki. Who was this really annoying character who would talk like this and go really energetic.
The actors are Skarsgård. Yeah, Skarsgård. Let me just say for the record, I actually think the Skarsgård family are excellent.
King.
Excellent. For example, the dad, was it Stefan?
Stefan, yeah.
Is unbelievable.
Stellan
is unbelievable in Andor. The son that was in...
he's in Dune as well.
Yes, he is. The son that was in Succession. God, what's his name?
I think that's Bill.
Is that Bill?
Or Alexander.
He's one of them. He's excellent. Mm-hmm. The one that's in the Pennywise, that one.
Probably Bill or Alexander, I guess.
I hope they're not the same as Floki. I don't think they are. He's excellent as well.
Floki's the oldest, I think.
Okay. The actor who plays Floki, and I'm sorry if you're, for some reason, watching this, but I absolutely despised your performance. I really did, man. I just found him so annoying. Like, I wanted to get into it so bad. I love a bit of medieval history. I love a bit of this and a bit of drama. You know, I love Game of Thrones, all that type of stuff. I loved it. And so I wanted to get into Vikings. And every time Floki was on screen, he'd go, "Oh, Ragnar!" And he was so annoying. And he would do these, like, convoluted, like, things going off away on the plot and doing something that would kind of just screw everything up, and it made no sense. There was like no logical reason for Floki to be this dick or this a-hole that would just go off and do all this stuff. Every time the show Vikings came up, Zach would just start doing the Floki accent and would just start going, "Oh, Ragnar," just to annoy me, because he knew how much it just really griped me. So that was probably my number one reason for not really getting into it. Having said that, I do know a little bit about Ragnar Lothbrok because of watching that show. And I do know that you asked about one of the names of his sons. I know he had a few, but the one I remember, his name is Bjorn. Bjorn Ironside.
Bjorn Ironside is another one of his children. He's a famous traveller. He eventually also becomes king of Sweden and Uppsala, which is, I think, part of middle Sweden. He led Viking raids into the Mediterranean. He sailed through Gibraltar, where he sacked it. He sailed past the south of France, and he sacked it. He sailed past Italy and Pisa, which he sacked.
Nice.
And he also went to parts of northern Africa. There's also Sigurd Snake in the Eye. He's another one of Ragnar's sons. He grew up to be the king of Denmark. Apparently he had an eye that looked like the Ouroboros, which is a snake biting its own tail. It's like, it's a classic hipster tattoo. Like, if you want to get, like, a tattoo and you think you're edgy, you'll get the Ouroboros. And the problem is, I have a really good friend who has the Ouroboros. She's going to listen to this and be like, "You fucking dickhead." These sons are incredibly important for the future of England and a lot of Europe in general. Ragnar eventually meets a tragic end.
Oh.
Yeah. He's captured by King Aela, who's at the time the ruler of Northumbria, and he's cast very famously into a pit of snakes. Some people say pit of wolves, but I think snakes are a lot cooler.
Damn.
He tragically meets his death in that pit of snakes.
Sorry, side tangent. You've got me thinking, what is the coolest death? And by coolest, I mean in terms of legacy. Obviously, if you're being eaten by a pit of snakes, it's not ideal. But I just mean in terms of, like, you know, the story is told of your death and everyone's like, damn.
I don't know, but the Blood Eagle was pretty famous.
That's a Viking thing as well.
It's a famous Viking execution method. They reserve the Blood Eagle for very few people because of its sheer barbarity. It's nasty. And they basically pull open your back, carve down your spine, and they pull the back open into two pieces. And they basically pull your lungs out from your back and splay them up high, and it looks like you have wings. So it's called a Blood Eagle.
Is it? And while they're still alive?
Yeah. Right. Alive the entire time. I do think it's also important to talk about a legendary Viking as well, called Rollo, who in the show, he is Ragnar's brother, which is not the case. He's completely unrelated to him. He is a Viking leader, Viking war leader, who became the Count of Rouen in France, in Normandy. Yeah. He's a leading warrior. He's gifted the land in 911 AD after the siege of Chartres by Charles the Simple, king of West Francia at the time. He's given the land if he swears allegiance to the Frankish king, converts to Christianity, and pledges to defend them from future Viking assaults. And he does that. This is a common thing. European kings would buy off Vikings as mercenaries to defend from other Vikings, because they just know how to fight them back, basically. Yeah. And he eventually becomes the Duke of Normandy. We'll go to now the most well-known son of Ragnar, Ivar the Boneless. So people think that he could have been weak or frail, or might have had a disease or something like that. There's loads of different interpretations of it, but it could also be a mistranslation of the Latin word exosus, which means to hate, the hated. Ivar the hated. Oh. So might not have been bonus at all. He might have just been a really massive dig. He was a uniquely brilliant strategist. He was an unbelievable commander in warfare. He was vital in leading this great heathen army. And this is a really important part of Viking and English history. The great heathen army landed in the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in 865 AD. They're motivated, arguably, by either a want to conquer England, like a need for new farmland, or because they wanted to avenge Ragnar, which is like a bit more romantic and it's a bit cooler. They landed in East Anglia, going on and capturing the city of York. Do you know what York was called back then?
Oh, no, I don't. It had a Roman name, right?
Mm-hmm. Oh. I don't know if it's Roman. It was Ethelwich.
Ah, okay.
But the Viking name for it was...
That's Celtic as
hell. It was known by the Vikings as Jorvik. And York was a legendary Roman fortress. It was pretty much one of the most prominent places in England at the time. And the Vikings captured it really, really easily. They turned up on a Sunday. Ivar, you see, he's always thinking. He's always like,
clever.
how can I get one over on my enemies? How am I going to make them feel weak and get them in the pants down?
It's God's day.
Yes, and they're all sitting there going, oh, me na ni na ni da.
Yeah, no fighting on God's day.
Amen. And he knows that they'll be praying because it's a Sunday and they're at Mass. I think, is Mass a Catholic thing?
Yeah.
Yeah. So they're praying in their cathedral and all of a sudden they hear bang, bang, bang on the big wooden wall leading into the cathedral. And then the screams and the bloodshed starts. And
Oh, hell yeah. This mass about to get lit.
These Vikings just massacred the entire town.
Oh, I'm so
Apparently,
sorry.
there's a story supposedly that Ivar, when he led his troops into York, because there's no one at all to stop them, they're all at church. And they're walking through his town, this massive Viking army just going through the streets, all the boarded up shops and windows and homes, and they're all closed. No one's there. And apparently a little boy comes out with a little wooden sword and tries to, like, have at them. And apparently Ivar gives him a comb, which is made out of bones. And I don't know to what extent that is real. So then they capture York. After that, they find and they capture King Aela, who killed Ragnar. And they give him the famous Blood Eagle. They Blood Eagle the living life out of him.
Oh, Jesus.
They Blood Eagle him so hard. The Great Heathen Army then goes on to win campaigns in Mercia and East Anglia. And they basically take a vast swathe of England. The only place they didn't take was Wessex, which is southwest England. It's basically the capital at the time was Winchester. It's probably like the biggest English kingdom at the time, Wessex. It was ruled at the time by a guy called Alfred. Do you know his nickname?
The Great.
The Great. Alfred the Great defeats the Vikings at the Battle of Edington. What a great guy. Just real great things, beating them at the Battle of Edington. They led to a treaty where the Vikings remained in control of northern and eastern England. And they basically established what's called Danelaw.
Yes.
Which was, you know about that?
No,
Oh,
I just heard of the
Heard
word,
it?
and it sounds quite cool. It's got something to do with Danes and law, I imagine.
Where on earth did you get that from?
No, I think it's because the words are together. That's my guess.
So it's Danelaw. It's like it's a split down the middle of England, separating Wessex on the west to the eastern side, which are Vikings. And splits the country in two. There's Vikings, Danes, Norsemen on one side, and Wessex, English.
So basically, the country of England is now split in two. One with the Catholic law, the Catholic provinces, the Catholic way of life, and the north, which is the Danish, but, you know, the Norse way of life.
At this time, they're actually slowly becoming Christians. Like, they very quickly quite like Christianity, and they start taking it a bit seriously.
Which is really interesting, because that, and I'm sure that you're going to tell me off for going ahead in the story, but that is kind of, in essence, the death of the Vikings. It's literally the fact that this concept of people that are going to adventure somewhere and essentially migrate often, at the end of the day, your story will end. If you go and migrate somewhere, then the story of you people, the migrators, will eventually go, because you're now going to take in this new culture. And it might not be the same culture that it was before, but it's going to be this new thing that's brought up. You're going to envelop into the actual population and the people and the Catholicism and all that. The English language is a huge mixture of Latin, German, a lot of French, Celtic, but there's some Norse words in there as well. And places like York are literally named because of the Viking term for Jorvik. That was the name of the town. So all these little things of this Norse culture survive to the day, but the Vikings don't, because they've all spread out amongst different places.
At that time, it's also because no one socializes. There's no social media, so you can't meet people of different ethnicities and cultures and different ways of life. So when you're exposed to them, it's just that much more significant.
Must have been nice.
On to the next Viking hero. It's a King Cnut the Great.
Ooh, great name, because it's instantly recognizable. If you see those four letters together, C-N-U-T together, you can't help but think it. You can't help it. I know all of you hearing Lord, what was his name? Lord Cnut?
King Cnut, mate.
King Cnut. Oh, it's even better. King Cnut. You're going to hear it, and you're going to think those four letters been in a different combination.
Stop leading our audiences to vulgar thoughts.
I'm so vulgar again. The Volga River. You can't help yourself. What is it with you?
Here
the
I
Volga
go.
River.
So King Cnut invaded England in 1015. He led a huge Viking army, probably bigger than the Great Heathen Army, I'd say, because more people were alive at this point in time, 200 years later. He defeated King Edmund Ironside in 1016 and became the ruler of England, like I said, merging it with the English crown. He was great, a really good ruler. He brought prosperity and economic growth to England, which became really wealthy following his reign. He promoted and protected the church, which was a very strange thing for a former Viking to do. But at this time, most Vikings were actually becoming... It was a dominant religion now in Scandinavia and the Vikings. They were all Christians. He married Emma of Normandy, forging alliances with the Holy Roman Empire. He was just a great diplomat, like a really skilled guy in general. Like he knew they come around every so often, these leaders, which they're like great on the economic side. They're really good at diplomacy. They keep the king together. When he dies eventually, there's a massive power gulf. And this happens across history. You get like these really strong leaders centralizing and organizing power, bringing it under their own reign, and then all of a sudden they die. And their 10 sons are fighting for power, or this random warlord out of God fuck knows where. Just like they're all coming together for it because they sense, there's a split and a fracture, and they could gain from it.
It's such an interesting thing, that concept throughout history, when you're able to centralize power so well to the point where it's kind of like you end up being the bringer of your own downfall, because you're so good at your job that it makes the follow-up really difficult. We're both football fans, and this is not no, but I'm being genuine. They're very different scenarios, but there is certainly some truth to them. When you're so good at your job, so good at being able to hold everything together because everyone believes in the forward nature of what you're saying and what you want to do, when you do leave, it becomes so difficult to keep that same momentum and that same like promise and belief. And Man United, Arsenal, Liverpool are teams that had a manager that stayed there for ages, and it's difficult when that person gets replaced for the next in line to be able to pick up the pieces. And in history, it's without doubt that happens all the time.
So King Cnut also introduced a lot of law and order to English kingdoms. He basically wanted a lot more, like I said before, things under his control, because the way that kings at that time were great was by centralizing power, by making sure like they had local levies to join their military, by making sure peasants paid taxes, stuff like that.
What's levies?
Levies are when townsfolk or different areas of a country kind of lend their villages and their peasants to the king's royal army. Like basically go on his escapades. It's
just the way that the kings then get the lords to then get the working class, the peasants and whoever to fight for them.
He also brought about the idea of the king's peace and social order, and introduced provisions on inheritance and protection of property. So generally a very forward-thinking king at the time.
Yeah.
Eventually
absolutely.
He dies, like I say, and this leaves a power gulf. So moving on to my next Viking, which I think is history's hardest hit person. Oh, that's actually a massive statement to say.
Hardest hit person.
You'll see. So Leif Erikson, and he has a statue of himself in Duluth, Minnesota, which is
Minnesota?
not it's not a good enough shrine for someone who did what he did. He was the go on. Oh no, you got it. Go on.
Well, Minnesota. Is he the one that travelled to America?
He's the first European to set foot on continental North America.
Yep.
Not Columbus.
Yes.
Not this fraud. This false hero.
Thank you.
This Columbus is a fraud.
Yeah, amen.
Leif Erikson is the legend.
Yeah.
And he's got no reputation. No one knows about him. This is probably the first time you guys have heard about Leif Erikson.
Technically, isn't Columbus the third? Because there was another Spaniard. Columbus gets all the credit, despite the fact that he actually did like nothing.
Yeah.
But yes, this is, and we have an American audience. Crazily, I didn't expect it. Yeah.
What's happening, y'all?
It's our second most viewed country after England. Did you know that?
No.
That's a little fact for you about the intrigue of pint-sized history. But anyway, more importantly, America, our second most viewed. All you Americans out there,
you suck the boots off this Columbus.
I'm sorry, Columbus sucks, man. Who cares? Who cares about this guy? He's nothing. This guy, Leif Erikson, who had only heard the name of about 20 seconds ago, he's the one. He's the one who should have the shrine of it, not just Minnesota, but everywhere.
Leif Erikson is the son of Eric the Red. And did you see that? Erikson? This is like what Vikings did with their names. They, if you were a son of someone, you'd be that person's son, so I'd be Zack Gideon's son.
You know, every now and then you notice these small little things about like how there are lots of cultures that make up British culture throughout history, and the Vikings and Norse culture is not one of those heavy ones. But you still notice those little differences each and every day. The fact that certain names have son in the end, Simpson, all that is Thompson. Because Thompson is because of this. Norse. You call your son after that. Like it makes sense because in English, son is son, but this is this is derived from Norse. You know what the Latin is, or Latin? I don't know what the Latin is. You know what the Italian is for son?
No.
Figlio. Completely different. But the point I'm making is, often these very obvious words, like patriarchal is patriarchy and all this. Madre is mother. But son is completely different because it's a different word from a different language. It's Norse. All these tiny little things that you take for granted in the English language and English culture.
I'll never take them for granted again.
It's because of the Vikings. And don't you forget it, all right? Every time you say, hey, Simpsons, I love the Simpsons.
Yeah.
Remember?
Son of Simp.
Son of the Simps. Exactly. Well said. The Vikings did it. Vikings did it first.
Okay. Cool tangent. He is the son of Eric the Red. Eric the Red is a Viking who founded the first Norse settlement in Greenland, where Leif was raised. Eric the Red's dad was a murderer, and he got exiled from Norway. And when people get exiled from Norway, it's a bit of a death sentence. But he ended up making his way to Iceland. I don't think he settled it, but he made his way there after being exiled from Norway. Eric the Red then murdered someone in Iceland, like father, like son.
Oof.
And he left Iceland and settled on Greenland.
What a legacy for Leif.
A legacy of blood and murder follows the settlements of Norway to Iceland to Greenland.
It's tough.
Leif then, as a traveller, like his lovely parents before him, decides to explore North America, or wants to go exploring. And he is the first person set foot on North America, or first European, in 1000 AD, 500 years before Columbus, which is crazy because he's doing it in like these longboats. Like, they had bigger longboats specifically for these journeys where they're a bit deeper and you could put like cargo in it. Thousands of kilometers in these things, which is mental that they're able to do that.
Just get lost.
He lands on the modern day coast of Newfoundland in Canada, specifically the site known as L'Anse aux Meadows, which is now an archaeological site. And he found this land, and according to the saga, it's a plentiful land, great resources, wild grapes, rich pastures, mild climate, and fertile land. So perfect for settlement. Eventually dies out after 400 years, but the fact that it gets that far without like strong links or any proximity to other countries is pretty good in itself.
The idea of going across these vast oceans, you would it was a death sentence. Like you said, it was literally a death sentence because the chance of you actually finding anything was so small. You thought realistically we might just end up dying on this boat. And so it's scary. And so to think that there are these people, these adventurers, which is essentially what the Vikings are, just adventurers that went out and did something crazy. These guys went out and went so far out that they were able to discover a place that had never been found before by Europeans. And it took another hundreds and hundreds of years before they did it. I mean, what year did you say that this Erikson thing was?
1000 AD.
1000 AD. And Columbus...
I think it's 1480 or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. So 500 years after is when this stuff happened. So roughly, it's insane.
The next Viking, you said it yourself, Joe, he's your favourite Viking. He's Harald Hardrada.
Yes, Harold, my boy. I love him. I love him like a son.
What do you love about him?
Everyone talks about how 1066 is this incredibly important year for English history and therefore British history and therefore in essence world history. Yeah, no one really cares about my boy Harold, who is like
bad hand.
It's because he just went for something and it didn't pay off. No. But I think we can all relate. You know, those times where you just go for something and it doesn't pay off. You know, and you go for it and you think this is going to be hype, and then it just doesn't really. It kind of fizzles out, and you're like, well, at least I did it. That's Harold.
You know, you just think you got to go for it. You got to grab life by the balls, or the horns.
Yeah. It's funny because
horns.
You think about it and it's like Vikings are known for this sense of taking the initiative, taking the risk and going out and travelling. Some of them iconically work out. He doesn't.
Harald Hardrada, or known as Harald Hardruler, because he's a massive twat. It's a proper rags to riches story, this. He was the grandson of a king, so not really rags here. And he's also the son of a strong chief in Norway. But his family were then forced into exile following defeat at the Battle of Skittelskad.
Ah, yes, of course.
Famous. In defiance against Cnut the Great. You don't fuck with Cnut.
No.
He was
defeated. Fuck with any Cnut.
Nah. So Harold and his family were defeated and he was badly wounded. He fled to Kievan Rus, which is, like I said before, the Swedish had expanded to the east, while the Danes and Norwegians had fled to had conquered the west. And Kiev is a big Viking settlement. There, he's made a captain by the Grand Prince of Kiev, and he fights against his enemies for years. He was a really strong military leader. He was a great fighter and very experienced, but only 15 at this time, which is crazy. He then moved to the Byzantine Empire, in what is today known as Constantinople.
Yes.
Where it's Istanbul.
Absolutely.
And he served on the Varangian Guard.
Yeah, which is another thing I find so effing weird about the Vikings is the fact that you just pull up these other places in history, like Istanbul, and the Vikings just somehow have their place there in their own random way.
The Varangian Guard are elite units loyal to the Byzantine Emperor. They are paid handsomely for their work, and they are top-of-the-line warriors.
Yeah.
And Harold sits among them, and he is like the boss of them. He fights on every frontier against Arab pirates, and he fights deeper into Turkey against other enemies of the Byzantine
It's so funny.
Empire.
There's just like this
cool.
Norseman that's fighting these Arab
he's a good
pirates.
fighter, man.
It's just out of nowhere.
He goes and fights as far east as Iraq, and he even goes to Jerusalem. I think I read somewhere that he had a nice bath there. In doing so, like I said, he becomes really, really rich, and this funds his claim for the Norwegian crown. He comes back in 1046. He takes over the Norwegian crown, which he co-shares it basically with his brother Magnus. Here we got the nickname Hard Ruler or Hard Rider, because like I said, he was awful. He went around to farmers and maimed them. He killed them if they thought they were being disloyal or disobeying him or not paying their dues. He gets an invitation from Harold Godwinson, the King of England's brother. He gets an invitation to revolt against him and conquer England. He then sails to England with dreams of conquering it, but gets caught off guard by Harold Godwinson, who deserves more credit than he's due in the history books, and he is killed by him in a surprise attack at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. He was struck in the throat by an arrow and killed at the battle, but the craziest thing with the Battle of Stamford Bridge, and I think you said you knew this earlier, Joe, so I'll hand over the reins to you.
It's a bridge, obviously, and that there's one Viking, one Berserker Viking. I don't know his name. Are we aware of his name?
No. Okay. Just history books say he was they call him a gigantic Norwegian.
Yeah, I mean, literally imagine, without the stereotypes of maybe the horned helmet or the fact that he's like 7 foot with huge muscles. Ignore
I imagine
that.
he is the stereotype.
But
this single guy.
Exactly. But forgetting like that stereotype in general, imagine someone that is of that ilk, that kind of like really tall, intimidating looking, and apparently he holds up the bridge from this attack by Harold Godwinson's army on his own.
So they're surprised by the English forces, and this guy, while Harold Hardrider's army are trying to regroup, he holds off all the English forces on this one bridge by himself, and he kills apparently 40 Englishmen in the process of doing so.
I'd love to know how wide this bridge is.
Because it's quite narrow.
I imagine, it must. If for one person to hold it, it must be relatively narrow. But like, I'm interested, like how much he's able to just completely stop them from coming across.
Yeah, and this essentially ends the story of Harold Hardrider, and this also officially marks the end of the Viking Age. Let's give or take a couple hundred years on either side of the 793 date and 1066 date, but this is essentially the end of it, because European kingdoms were increasingly consolidated. They were made stronger, they organised effective military strategies, they made raiding harder, coastal defences, and also Vikingers became less popular and less frequent in Nordic countries.
Yeah.
The Norsemen didn't want to do that anymore. They were becoming Christians, they were... there was less of an onus to go out and fight because trading routes had become more secure.
Yeah.
So Viking just basically died out. It was a cool pastime for 200 years, but eventually it became really inefficient. There's no reason to do it when you can just trade instead.
The Norsemen that could have become Vikings decided to stay where they were.
Yeah.
And the Vikings that were Vikings decided to settle to the point where they were ingrained in the population, to the point where they were no longer Vikings.
Which leads me perfectly to, and I say this every podcast, and it never leads perfectly to that, to William the Conqueror. He is the great-great-grandson of Rollo of Normandy, Duke Rollo. And he is obviously the ruler of Normandy at the time, and he eventually goes on to conquer England. So the question I pose to you now, Joe, is, are we Vikings?
Well, yes. But the problem with that question is that we're of so many different generations down that you could also say we are Mongolians because we are the children of Genghis Khan. And I'm being genuine when I say it. I know it sounds ridiculous, but realistically, Genghis Khan had sex with everyone. Like everyone.
That guy really did something.
Like, what's the number? Hundreds or thousands of children? I'm not sure what the numbers is.
He killed like 10% of the world's population and fathered, like, indirectly through the lines, like, hundreds of thousands of kids, which is like millions.
We're
now.
joking, but like genuinely, like a huge proportion of the world's population have Genghis Khan in their blood, which is hilarious. And I imagine it's probably something similar for the King of England in 1066 because he is the descendant of a Viking.
And it wouldn't be a Pint-Sized History podcast without some really obscure facts. So I'm going to give you a sentence and you fill in the blank.
Okay.
The Vikings produced the biggest ever blank.
Fire.
No, it's the biggest ever poo. So the biggest pile of human shit has been fossilised and found under the construction of a Lloyd's Bank branch in York in 1972. Figure, Jorvik.
I thought it was fire because the word pyre comes from Norse. I thought like a big fire.
Oh, they did do effigies, but like
Effigies,
probably,
yeah.
But
That was my
bigger.
guess anyway.
Joe, do you want to play a game of Vikings, 2 truths and a lie?
Hell yes, I do.
I'll give you 3 statements. One of them is a lie, and 2 of them are truths. So the first story is Helga Leithsdotter, also known as Helga Fishwhip, was a famous shield maiden. She turned village seer eventually in her elder age, but she used to discipline naughty Viking children by slapping them round the face with trout, carp, and other smelly rotten fish she'd get her hands on. Number 2. Norsemen in Finland used to tie cow bones to their feet with leather straps and skate on frozen bodies of water, leading to the creation of what is known as today's modern-day ice skating. Number 3. Viking Viagra was a horse penis covered in onions.
Yeah, I can believe that one.
So, which one do you think's a lie?
The ice skating one.
That is a truth. So
I just felt like, really?
yep. And what's the other one you think's true?
The first one.
So you think the Helga Fishwhip is a truth?
No, now I know this new information. The Viagra thing is so ridiculous, it has to be true. The first one's fake.
Spot on, mate. Can't get anything past you.
Yeah.
So that's why I chose Vikings to do for the 5th episode. Like I said, I've been fascinated about them since I was a kid, and I just think these stories are incredible. I think it really speaks to like the human element of it, and like the just insaneness of the fact that these people with like fairly limited tools and like understanding were able to make these long boats and long ships that just changed the course of history drastically.
Well, I think one of the things that I find so fascinating about the Vikings is literally just the fact that they're so intertwined with everything that happens now, but just in the ways you don't expect, like the fact that there's sun, or the fact that there's a word berserk that comes from berserker, and all these little like tiny little things it shows how much of an influence they had worldwide. I mean, you said at the beginning they traveled as far as Baghdad. I thought, maybe I'm wrong, but I thought they traveled as far as like India as well. And obviously they went as far as Canada. They went everywhere. It's crazy how much of an influence they have on everything, despite the fact they're only 200 years old in terms of us as a society, and also the fact that there's nothing written down. They are a culture, and there's not many of them. They are a culture that has nothing written down about them at all. And I just think that's insane that you're able to pick up all this information. But anyway, that's it for this week. Really appreciate listening to you, Zach, and hearing all this stuff. I don't know what we're going to do next time. We haven't actually decided exactly what our choices next week, but it's been a lot of fun listening to you. And just want to say thanks, mate.
Thank you. And thank you all for listening. Hope you have a great rest of the week, and hope you enjoyed the podcast. Skål!
Skål.